February 1943. The Atlas Mountains, Tunisia. For the young men of the U.S. the Second Corps, the Great Crusade had just become a nightmare. In the narrow gap known as Kasserine Pass, the United States Army met the German Wehrmacht in a major engagement for the first time. The result wasn't just a defeat, it was a slaughter. Under the scorching sun, American units dissolved, radios crackled with panic, officers abandoned their posts. In just 6 days, the Americans suffered over 6,500 casualties. They lost nearly 200 tanks. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, watched the carnage with a mixture of professional contempt and relief. He wrote in his diary that the Americans were extraordinarily soft and lacked tactical sense. General Heinz Guderian dismissed them as amateurs. The German consensus was clear. The Americans were a nation of salesmen and farmers who lacked the warrior spirit of the Prussian tradition. They believed the Americans would never be a first-rate fighting force, but 18 months later, that tone changed. By the time the Allies reached the borders of the Reich, German veterans weren't laughing. They were terrified. Post-war interrogations revealed a startling truth. While they respected the British for their stubbornness and the Soviets for their sheer mass, it was the American infantry-artillery team they feared most. How did a soft army of amateurs transform into a machine that broke the back of the most professional military in history? This is the story of the Kasserine recovery, the revolution at Fort Sill, and the systemic genius of the American way of war. 2. The failure at Kasserine Pass was systemic. The U.S. Army had a Green Officer Corps and a doctrine that looked good on paper, but failed in the mud. However, the U.S. military possessed a trait the Germans lacked: institutional humility. General Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't make excuses. He fired commanders. He brought in George S. Patton to instill discipline. But the real change wasn't just about toughness. It was about learning. Just weeks after Kasserine, at the Battle of El Geta, the 1st Infantry Division faced a massive assault by the 10th Panzer Division. This time, the Americans didn't run. They dug in. They used their tank destroyers effectively. Most importantly, they demonstrated the first glimpses of what would become their god of war, massed artillery. If you ask a historian what won the war for America, they might say the Mustang or the atomic bomb. But if you asked a German Lanzer in a foxhole, he would say the American artillery. Before World War II, artillery was slow. A forward observer saw a target, called a battery, and they'd range it in. It took time. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the U.S. Army developed the Fire Direction Center (FDC), the math of death, while German and British artillery often operated in decentralized batteries. The Americans centralized their math. The FDC allowed a single forward observer, even a lowly private with a radio, to call for fire, and have every gun in range of the entire corps respond simultaneously. Then came the time on target. In a top mission, the FDC calculated the flight time of shells from different batteries at different distances. They would stagger the firing times so that every shell from dozens of different locations hit the exact same spot at the exact same second. German veterans said there was no warning, no ranging shots. One moment it was quiet, the next the entire world exploded. It was like the hand of God reaching down to crush us. To understand why the Germans feared the Americans differently than the British, we must look at doctrine. The British way. The British Army, haunted by the losses of WWII, favored set-piece battles. They were methodical, heavy on planning, and preferred to move only when they had overwhelming superiority. The American way. The Americans were aggressive to a fault. They emphasized mobile combined arms. If they hit a wall, they didn't wait for a week to plan a breakthrough. They called for 500 for 7 Thunderbolts and 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers to blast a hole in it within the hour. Normandy was where the theory met the meat grinder. The bocage ancient, stone-hard hedgerows turned the landscape into a series of natural fortresses. German paratroopers and SS units used these to devastating effect. But here, the American institutional learning kicked in again. The Rhino tank. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen welded scrap metal teeth to the front of Sherman's to plow through hedges, the Jobos. The U.S. infantry began working in direct radio contact with P-47 pilots. In July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the U.S. Army did something the Germans thought impossible. They used heavy strategic bombers as tactical support. They liquefied the German front line. The fields were fit only for the grave. My front had disappeared. There was nothing left but dust and death. December 1944. Hitler's last gamble. Mans threw their best remaining armor into the Ardennes, hoping to repeat their 1940 success. At Kasserine, the Americans had folded under pressure. At the Battle of the Bulge, they held. At places like Saint-Vith and Bastogne, American units were surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing. But the amateurs of 1943 were gone. The U.S. infantryman of 1944 was a specialist in active defense. They used the M1 Garand's high rate of fire to simulate larger numbers. They used the proximity fuse, a top-secret radar-guided shell, to shred German infantry in the open. By the time the weather cleared, and the U.S. Air Force returned to the skies, the German High Command realized their assessment was wrong. The Americans hadn't just matched European standards, they had set a new one. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt, noted after the war that the American ability to improvise and their extraordinary flexibility in logistics and fire support made them the most dangerous opponent on the Western Front. The U.S. Army didn't win simply because they had more trucks or more Can-Am. They won because they built a system, a learning organization that could absorb a defeat like Kasserine, analyze it, and build a better way to fight. They turned the civilian skills of a democratic society, communication, industrial management, and rapid technical innovation into the most lethal combat system the world had ever seen. From the humiliations of the Tunisian desert to the gates of Berlin, the amateurs had become the masters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into military history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe.